What's up Facebook, this is Tubedigga. I've never said that before, I usually say what's up YouTube, this is Tubedigga. Who cares? Anyway, I'm doing this beginner's guide tonight, completely impromptu, on all the MPC-X controls and connections. So this video is for anyone that has just bought an MPC-X or anyone that's thinking of buying an MPC-X and are a bit intimidated by all the controls and connections that you see on the machine. So let's start with the top panel controls of the MPC-X. So if you're new to the MPC-X, I'm going to take you through all these controls and tell you what they all do. So these are your pad bank buttons. Now these perform 4 main functions. So let's first of all take a look at a drum program. So when it comes to a drum program, essentially the pad banks are giving you access to additional virtual banks of 16 pads that extend the limitations of the 16 physical pads. So let's say we've loaded up a whole bunch of samples on these 16 pads here, and we go up to pad bank B, and now the pads will be completely blank and we can load another whole bunch of 16 pads, and so on and so forth, until we completely max out the entire drum program. Now a drum program can accommodate 128 pads, each with a sample on it, but additionally to that, each pad can have up to 4 layers. That's another conversation to have. Let's just stick to the pad banks. The reason I'm telling you that is that you can access the upper layers of pad banks if you, in my case, you can just press the pad bank button once. Now I've got mine set up to do that. So if there's anyone watching that's already got an MPC-X and thinks they know all of this stuff, there might be some things in this video that you will learn if you haven't come across it. So don't, not watch it if you have some experience with this machine. Let's get back to the pad bank. So if I want to go into the upper 4 banks, so these first 4 banks here, 16 samples each, or 16 pads each, and then we've got an additional 4 banks. So we've got E, F, G and H. Now I can just switch between the banks. So we're in pad bank A and now we're in pad bank E, pad bank B, or rather B when it's red, and F when it's yellow, C when it's red, and G when it's yellow, D when it's red, and H when it's yellow. Let's go to the menu and go to the gear symbol, which is the preferences. And if we go down to general, you can change the behavior of how you access those pad banks. So you can see it says here bank button press. Now I've got mine set to select toggle bank, which is the alternative mode. I just prefer it because it's easier to just press it once and then twice to access the upper level of banks. But the default behavior is select A to D. This means that you have to double tap the pad bank buttons in quick succession to access the upper banks. And as you can see, I'm in pad bank F now, but if I press C, it goes straight to the lower bank of C. Or you can press and hold shift and press 1 and you can access the upper banks, but you can't toggle between them even if you're holding shift. So I recommend, it's totally up to you guys, but select toggle bank is the quickest and easiest way to switch between the lower 4 banks and the upper 4 banks. So let's get back to what we're saying about drum programs. So that's what they do regarding drum programs. They allow you to access the additional virtual pads, let's say, for a drum program, which can have 128 pads in it in total. When it comes to key group programs, it's slightly different because you have a chromatic program in this regard. Now there's 4 chromatic program types in the MPC Live and MPC-X. You've got plug-in programs, so this is TubeSynth. So you can see now that the pads are acting as octave, or the pad banks are acting as octave shifters. You can go all the way down to the bottom, and then if I press this button twice, I'm in the very upper octave range. So that's what they do when you're using a chromatic program, whether that's a plug-in key group program MIDI program or CV program. That's what they do for chromatic program type, so they can be used for that. The third thing that you can use the pad bank buttons for is pad performance. I just need to clear my throat. 1 second. Excuse me. So when you're using pad performance, the pad bank buttons can be used to shift up the octaves in the same way that I just showed you. So we're not actually. Let's go back to TubeSynth, the plugin program. Let's go to pad performance. Now you can see here that this will shift the octaves. But these will also shift the octaves. So vice versa, they can offset each other. So that's the third use for the pad bank buttons. So you can offset the octaves depending on what you've got it set in the pad performance mode, or if you're using the pad bank buttons themselves. Hope that makes sense. Now the fourth use for them is if you're in next sequence mode. So if you're new to the MPC format, next sequence mode allows you to use your pads to trigger your sequences in your project. So if you look here, we've got the list of sequences. So this current space that we can see in this list will show us the first 8 sequences. So the first 8 sequences can be accessed by triggering these pads. And you can see when I press the pads, it's just jumping up through the list. With the pad banks, let's just press pad bank C and then press, in fact, let's actually press that twice and go to pad bank E. If I press this pad now, that will give us access to sequence 65. Because obviously you've got 16 sequences when you're in pad bank A, because it's corresponding to the pads. Pad bank B, you've got another 16. So 32, 48, 64. So then when you're in pad bank E, you are on sequence 65. 66, 67, 68, and so on and so forth. All the way up to pad bank H. If I press the last pad in pad bank H, that is sequence 128. Because in any given project, you can have up to 128 sequences. So that's the 4 uses of the pad bank buttons. So I hope you've got that locked down now. That is what the pad bank buttons do, and that is their main functions in the MPC. Let's move down to the full level and half level button. So let's disengage it. That is the default mode for full level, and that means whatever sounds we play on the pads, they're going to respond to the amount of pressure. So they, in this regard, are velocity sensitive. If we engage full level, the pads will now trigger whatever sounds we're playing, whether it's a plugin, MIDI program, key group program, or drum program, at full level. So obviously that depends on the actual volume of the sample that is sort of hard set in either the pad mixer or the program or within the program editor itself. But full level will play them at their full level. It's pretty much does what it says on the tin. Now, if you press and hold shift and press full level, you can see the full level button flash now. This means the pads are now in half level mode. So again, no matter what volume you've got them set in the background, they will play at 50% of their full level and they won't respond to pressure. So when in full level or half level mode, they won't respond, they're not velocity sensitive and they won't respond to pressure. That's what the full level button does. 16 level, things get a little bit complex. So 16 levels is for use predominantly when you're using drum programs. So if you press a pad that you want to apply the 16 levels to, so I've not got any sounds loaded in my MPC at the moment, so I'm going to make sure I'm in sequence 1. I don't know why I'm using that. I can just go to next sequence mode, press my pad bank, and there you go, we've jumped down to sequence 1. So let's go to the browser. I'm going to go to places. In fact, I'm going to go to expansions and load in a sample, just a simple sample to my first pad. I'll make sure I'm in a drum program. Go back to the browser. and go to the vault. Now, I've no idea what to sample to use for this. I've not planned this at all. So let's get a tom or something a bit more musical sounding. This'll do, this is fine. Hello, come in. So let's go back and take a look at 16 level. So I've got this tom sound on my first pad in this drum program. To apply 16 levels to this, I press 16 level. If I had additional samples, I could use the data wheel to access other samples to apply the 16 level function to. Now, what 16 level does, in brief, allows you to do 6 different things here. So we can use the pads going from pad 1 to pad 16 to control the velocity. And you can see the pad or the sound gets louder as we go up through the pads. Even if we've got full level engaged, it overrides that and 16 levels becomes the thing that's controlling the velocity in that regard. The next one is tuning. This is the classic one that's been around in MPC forever, or the one that's most commonly used. So you can change the pitch of a given sample. Over here, when you're using tune in 16 levels, you can offset the kind of range. So as you might know, in an octave there's 12 notes. So if we choose this parameter here, which is, I forget, it's original pad, that's it. You can choose the original tuning or the default pitch to be on one of these pads. So currently it's set to 1, so that's the default pitch. And if we play from pad 1 up to pad 12, that will give us a full octave. But these last 4 pads will be the same as the last note on pad 12. I do apologise, it's actually 1 semitone up from that, but then they're all the same. That's because there's 12 notes in an octave, and obviously we've got 16 pads here, so the last 4 pads are irrelevant. If we move that up to pad 4 to be the original pitch, this will now give us a full range across the 16 pads because we're offsetting it by 4. And now we've got 16 levels of tuning. So that's the default, but I think my MPCX has been left at 1, and I think it remembers that setting. So I hope that makes sense. If you choose the original pad to be the last pad, pad 16, obviously you can then go down in pitch. But when you get to here, these 4 pads then are all the same pitch. That's because this is the octave and these are out of range. Likewise, if we choose the original pad to be pad 12, now we get the full range of pads or full range of notes, but we get a lower pitch. That is tuning. It can also affect the filter. So let's just press and hold menu, go to pad 14. That's the shortcut to get to your program editor. If you take a look at the filter envelope page, the default filter that I've got set, and I think it is the default one for most MPC X's and Lives, it's the low pass 2 filter, and you can see that it's fully open here. So even though it's set to fully open, let's adjust it actually. Now you can't hear any change because that's because we've got it in 16 level mode and we're controlling the filter. So 16 level has overridden the filter. So this is what happens now. So it's opening up the filter as you go up through the pads. So it doesn't matter what we've got this set to, but it does matter if you change the filter type. So let's now change it to a high pass filter. And now you hear the high pass filter being opened up. In fact, I made a mistake there. I pressed another pad. I need to select the pad that we want to apply 16 levels to, which is this first pad, and change the filter type for that. Now it's a bit weird, it doesn't jump smoothly from pad 1 up to there, and that's probably because Well, I was going to say probably because of the original pad setting, but that only applies to tuning. So this is something that I think I need to flag up with Akai, is that, I mean, it's not a massive deal because I very rarely use this, but it's a function that's available to us, but it's not a very smooth sweep from going up with the frequencies. Let's go back to 16 levels and filter, yeah. So it jumps quite quickly out of range, and then these last pads are very quiet. But you can control the filter with 16 levels. Layer, I've had trouble with this. I'm not too sure how to use it for layer. I've experimented with that and I cannot get it to work. I'm not too sure whether this is a bug also. You can also control the amplitude envelope attack parameter. So let's actually go back to the program editor and choose our pad. And let's just return it back to a low pass filter. And as you can hear now, I'm controlling the attack with 16 levels. So as we go up through the pads, we're essentially moving the attack of the amplitude envelope. So it's essentially going like that. By the time you get to pad 16, it's a very smooth curve. So it's just gently rolling off the attack. Likewise, you can control the decay. Now this only works, let's close that, look at the program editor. This only works when you've got it in one-shot mode and the amplitude envelope is pretty much shut down. So I like to use the attack, hold, decay, sustain envelope. Let's bring the sustain and the decay all the way to 0. I actually did that for a different pad. I do apologise. Let's bring that down to 0 and decay to 0. And now you can hear as we go up through the pads, it will gradually, it should elongate the sound, but it's not doing that for some reason. Let's go and check out why not. Decay. There you go. Just had to re-engage 16 levels. So as we go up through the pads, it's gradually opening up the decay. So that one works quite nicely for stuttering effect, particularly with note repeat. Quite a nice little tip there. So that is what the 16 level button does. Excuse me, just had to clear my throat again. I've got a bit of a dry mouth. I'm going to have some water and I shall return in 2 seconds. Water. Yeah. Right, so where were we? We've covered 16 level. Next button is track mute or pad mute. So this allows you to access your track mutes. So let's say we had several tracks. We can just use the pads now to mute and unmute the tracks. If we use the secondary function by double tapping in quick succession, or pressing and holding shift and pressing track mute, we're now in pad mute mode, so we can mute individual pads. Now we can only mute this one pad because we've only got one sample in there. Now something that's come up on some of the groups here is that the automation of track muting and pad muting are separate. So to record track mutes, you have to use your transport controls and record it into the sequence. So let's just record, just mute and unmute a few times, and you can see now that's automated that. Now if we go to the main page and just look at the top of the main page, you can see that we've got the automation button here. That will not allow you, if you put it into right automation mode when it's red like this, that will not record your track mutes. That will record your pad mutes. So this time I'm not going to press record and play on the sequencer. I'm just going to press play. I'm going to go into pad mute mode, and now I can record the pad mutes with the automation. The reason for that is because tracks are looking at the actual track and sequence data, and pads and all the parameters of pads are controlled by automation. That's why it's separate. That's my basic explanation. So that's what that button does. Toggles between track mute and pad mute with a quick little overview of how to record the automation there. Hope that's been of use. Let's go to the next sequence mode. I showed you this earlier. This is where you use the pads to trigger your sequences, and you can use the pad banks to jump up through the different banks of sequences, and you've got 128 in total. The secondary function for this, if you double tap in quick succession, again, you can press and hold shift and press that, is song mode. I'm not going to go into song mode. If you want to check out my YouTube channel, I've got plenty of videos on song mode, but that is how you access song mode. This is where, for beginners, if you don't already know this, you can stitch together all your sequences. You can convert it to a longer sequence, self-contained. You can export it as an audio file. You can do lots of things with song mode. That is that button. Let's move down here. We've got the program edit button on the MPC-X. On the MPC Live, or for all users, press and hold menu like I've shown you, and you press pad 14, and that's the shortcut. You've got your sample edit button. Again, if you press and hold menu and press, let me think, it's pad 13, that takes you straight to sample edit, or you can use the dedicated button on the MPC-X. You've got your pad mixer button here. So this is dedicated to where you do all your mixing with your pads. And the luxury of having the MPC-X is you've got all these lovely cue links to just freely mix all your pads. Don't know what's going on with my voice tonight. I've got a frog in my throat. So that hasn't got a secondary function. Then you've got your channel mixer, and this is where you can mix all your individual programs. So this isn't a track mixer, this is the programs, okay? Let's go down to these buttons. These are your cue link modes. So I usually have mine in screen control mode, but you've got all these different modes. You've got pad parameter mode, pad scene, program, and project. So if you also check my YouTube channel, I've got a detailed video on how to edit all these and what the different modes are. But they do have a secondary function. If you press and hold shift, you can access the editor to edit the different modes. So pressing and holding shift and going through them will switch the modes. Or in fact, you only have to press and hold shift once to access the editor, and then you can just flick between the modes. That's what they do. Obviously, these are your cue link controls where you can control tons of different parameters. You've got your pads. Now let's take a look at these buttons. So these are buttons to access the menu. That will take you straight to your main menu. The browse button will access the browser. If you press and hold shift and press browse, I'm not going to do that. That will immediately save the project. In fact, I can do that because I've not saved this before. But let's say you've already saved the project. A quick way to just save the project immediately is to press and hold shift and press the browse button, and that will save it. But because I haven't saved this before, this will give me the option to save as. Next, we've got the step sequencer button, and the secondary function is the list editor. So if we press that, we can access the step sequencer. If we press and hold shift, press it again, it turns yellow for the secondary function, and now we've got the list editor where you can do detailed editing of events that you've recorded. The next one is sampler and looper. So press and hold shift, press sampler, and you can access the looper, or just press it once, access the sampler. You've got your XY effects, which is the real-time kind of effects controller. That doesn't have a secondary function. And then you've got pad performance mode here. Now, if you see, there's a little white line that goes down here to F key. This is function key, and it's been available pretty much in the last several MPCs that I've owned. It certainly was in the MPC 5000 and also the MPC 1000 that I had. But if you press F key, you can notice all these buttons now turn red. So let's go back to the main page, and you can see on the main page, as an example, we've got MIDI tracks, audio tracks, we've got track decrement and increment, or up and down, we've got mute and solo. These buttons now will emulate these functions here. So we can choose MIDI tracks, audio tracks, track up and down. In fact, let's go back to MIDI and you can see that going up and down for the MIDI tracks. You can mute whatever track you're on or solo whatever track you're on. So that's what the F key does. So I'm going to move away from this section and go up to here and talk about these knobs now. So this is your main volume knob. This controls the main output of the MPC-X. Next to that, you've got your inputs 3 and 4 record gain knob. So if you've got an audio source connected to the rear panel of the MPC-X, now I should have an image of that. So if you just look to the right of the two big inputs, the combination inputs as they're referred to, these are XLR inputs and 1/4 inch jack inputs. If you just look to the left of that, you've got your inputs 3 and 4. So you can see there's two 1/4 inch or vertically orientated inputs, and next to that you've got phono inputs, and then next to that you've got a switch that says line and phono. So if you're using the RCA phono inputs and you're recording from a turntable, you want to switch that switch to phono, and that will record any audio source that you've got connected to the phono connection, which would usually be a turntable. So if you're using the 1/4 inch vertically orientated ports, that is inputs 3 and 4, but that's the line connection. So if you've got a CD player or another synth or another line level source, you can connect that there. So let's return back to the top panel. Now that is the gain and that is grouped. So those are that is like a stereo kind of gain control for both of those inputs. You don't have individual control, but you do for inputs 1 and 2. So let's just take a look at the rear again. So looking to the furthest left, these are your inputs, your main inputs 1 and 2. So they're combi jacks or combi inputs, and they're called combination or combi inputs because they're a combination of XLR, but you can also put a 1/4 inch jack inside there. So XLR is generally used for microphones because it's a higher quality and it's a shielded kind of connection. You can also use two different types of 1/4 inch jacks in these ports. You can use what's known as an unbalanced cable or a balanced cable. So unbalanced or TS cables are generally more susceptible to noise, but a TRS cable, which means tip ring sleeve, is less susceptible to noise. That's the basic explanation. So you can use either, but just bear in mind that an unbalanced 1/4 inch jack cable for your recording might be prone to some noise depending on how you've got your system set up. So let's go back to the main view or the top page again, or the top panel. So that is what the 3/4 gain knob does. It controls your inputs 3 and 4 gain, and these two knobs can increase the gain of inputs 1 and 2, which I've just shown you are the main combi inputs. But they also control the front panel audio inputs, which are called the instrument inputs. They are the two 1/4 inch jacks you can see just to the left of that knob. It's quite hard. So if you look at the SD card on the left, move across to the two foot switch ports, and next to that you've got two instrument ports. So these are also inputs 1 and 2, but they're selectable by switching these switches down to where it says front. So if you want to record from the main inputs 1 and 2 at the rear, you choose rear. If you want to record from the two front ports, you choose front. But you can mix and match those, but obviously one of them's going to be on one side and one of them's going to be on the other side. In the middle of those, you've got your 48 volts phantom power switch. This provides additional power to any microphones that you may have connected to the XLR connection for inputs 1 and 2. XLR is the only connection that will accept the 48 volts phantom power, or rather will be provided to. So it will only provide that phantom power to an XLR that's connected, and that's generally used for microphones, a condenser microphone that needs that extra boost in volume. But as said, these two gain potentiometers can increase the gain of either the rear mounted inputs 1 and 2 or the front mounted ones. Just had to clear my throat again, and I did a massive burp, so pardon me. So let's move down to these controls here. So this control is your monitor control. So when it's panned hard right, you are hearing the main output, which is, you know, controlled. The volume is controlled by this master knob. If you move this knob towards the left or anti-clockwise, you'll start to hear any incoming audio that you've got coming into the MPC. So this is a quick way to monitor what you're recording. You can switch that between mono and stereo, and if you do that whilst listening to what you're recording with this moved slightly or all the way to the left, you will hear that switch between stereo and mono. Depending on how you've actually got it connected, that will affect that. Let's now talk about the VU meter. Now you can change what the VU meter is looking at. Mine's currently set to program, so I'm looking at any audio that's coming from the program. And these buttons here are a combination of functions. So you can arm record audio tracks with this button. So record arm, let's go to an audio track. If I press that button, you can now see that the audio track is armed. So that's quick access to that. You've got your automation read and write button here. So if you click that, you can see that changes your automation button. So that's just a quick front panel or top panel mounted access for that function. You can solo the current program that you're on with this button. Now mute, you can mute an audio track here, but if we go to MIDI, you can see that it's not working for MIDI. Even if I unmute it from there, this isn't muting that. This is because this is muting the track. So if we go to the track mixer view here, you can see that, in fact, is that doing that now? Let's go to the channel mixer. It's muting the program. So it's not muting the track from the main page. If we press mute, you can see this, this is referring to the actual track. It's not muting the track. But if you go to the channel mixer to look at the program, this is now muting the program. So this is relating to programs. That's all those controls covered. Let's go down to here. We've got arrays. So if you press arrays, that is a quick way to access the arrays menu, and you can erase all events in a sequence. You can erase just the automation. You can erase specific notes. If you tap on there, you can see you populate these grids or the grid with certain notes, and we can just erase specific notes. Except note, now I'm going to admit something that I made a mistake. I think I actually made this mistake recently in a video, and looking back at some of my old videos, I made the mistake of saying that this erases everything except the note data, which is not true at all. It actually erases any notes except the ones that you select. So if we choose accept note and we choose the notes that we don't want to erase, so we just, let's say I want to retain these ones that are highlighted. If I press do it, it'll erase every other pad that I've recorded, and it will keep these pads or the notes that correspond to these pads in the sequence. That's what accept note does. And just up here, you can choose the range of where you erase, you can choose the sequence, and you can choose the track which you want to erase. If you go up to the pencil icon here, you can also choose erase there. So you might already know this, but let's say you're playing back, you can't press erase and access the erase function whilst playing back or whilst recording. But you can, if you go into the sequence edit menu, you can choose erase, and whilst it's playing back, you can actually erase things during playback, if you didn't already know that. So let's have a look. Microphone's still working. Now, that's erase. Now we've got undo and redo. So undo is just simple. You just can undo anything that you've previously done. If you press and hold shift and press undo, that will redo something. You've got copy. So this copy button refers to either copying pads. So if we press copy, you get this come up. Let's choose this pad. We want to copy that pad. You have to press on the screen, choose the pad you want to copy it to, press do it, and now we've copied that pad to this pad here. The other way that you can use the copy button is in the grid editor. So let's just put a note in there. Let's select it. We can copy that note and it'll instantly copy it and paste it for us along the grid. The secondary function for that is delete. So if you press and hold shift and press delete, now it won't delete the notes in the grid editor, it allows you to delete pads. So if we want to delete this pad that we copied just a second ago, we can choose that pad and we can just delete that pad, and that clears the sample off of that pad. That's what that does. So that's everything covered here. This is your main data dial. Now this has been around in MPCs since day one. Whatever dialog box or selection box or parameter that you're currently on, you can just use the data wheel as a really quick way to scroll through different parameters or different values and so on and so forth. Underneath that you've got an increment and decrement button. So depending on what mode you're in or what window you're in, let's use it to go up through the sequences. You press plus and you can see you can just scroll up through the sequences or scroll down. Next to that you've got a numeric keypad. Now this is something that not a lot of people know, but if you choose something like the sequence selection box here, if you type in 45 for example and press enter, it will jump to sequence 45. So there's, I don't know if you can see that on there, but a little red value comes up there of whatever number I've put in the numeric keypad. I've put 23 in, press enter, and that will jump to sequence 23. Likewise, we could change the BPM. If I wanted to change the BPM down to 100, I could just use the numeric keypad and press do it. Or I could press this button in the middle of these arrow buttons. That's also an enter button. So this can be used to enter values, and this dedicated enter button can also. So that's the numeric keypad done. I've done the function key. Let's now look at tap tempo. So my current tempo is 100. Let's say I want a faster tempo. Now I've pressed that 4 times for the MPC to register it at the new tempo of 164.38. This is good if you've got another audio source that you want to get the MPC synced to or roughly synced to. You can tap in alongside in time to another beat and get somewhere near to matching that tempo, and then you can obviously adjust it if you want it to be an exact value. It's got a secondary function. If you press shift and press tap, you can see now that master is highlighted. This means now that every sequence in the project will adhere to a master tempo. My master tempo is 170, so that means all sequences will now be at 170 beats per minute. But if you press and hold shift and press it again to take it out of master mode, now it's in sequence mode, so now the tempo is based on each and every sequence has got its own independent tempo. So let's change sequence 7 to 141 beats per minute. Let's go back to sequence 1 and that's 170 beats per minute. My goodness, I've been going for nearly 40 minutes. Amazing. So let's now take a look at, let's just take a look at the settings for the tap tempo. If you go to menu, go to the gear symbol for your preferences. Now let's see, is it, yeah, there it's in general. So you can select the amount of taps that the MPC needs to register a new tempo from using the tap tempo. So you can set it to 2 taps, 3 taps or 4 taps. I've got mine set to 4 taps just because most music that I make is, you know, based on a 4/4 time signature. That's not to say I'm making 4 to the floor music. Please no. There's nothing wrong with it, it's just not my main thing. So yeah, that's the tap button and the master button. So we've covered all of this. We've got our main page button, so whatever mode we're in, we can just press that and continuously return to the main page. This can also access the track mixer. So if we press and hold shift and press that main button, that will access the track view, which you can access also from the screen here. I never use this. This is where you can mix or adjust the levels and volumes of your MIDI tracks. So once again, you can double tap that and that will go to there, or you can press and hold shift and tap that. This button here is your note repeat button. This allows you to repeat the note on a pad to give you kind of stuttering effects if you didn't already know. The secondary function is to latch that. So if you press and hold shift, you can lock that. If you don't use shift, you just have to press and hold it to trigger your sample to repeat it. Or your pad, even if you've got a plug-in program, note repeat will work on that as well. Also, if you press and hold note repeat, you can see you get your time divisions come up at the bottom of the screen. Underneath that, you've got your locate menu button. So you can go to a particular location in your sequence with this. If you press the locate button in the middle, it will bring up the location menu. I also have a YouTube video on my YouTube channel explaining the locate menu and all its functions. So I'm not going to go into that too much now. So you can go to specific events. You could go to the start of your sequence or the end of your sequence, or start of bars, end of bars, so on and so forth. And then of course we've got our transport controls. This is your main record button. If you've already recorded data and then you use the main record button, it will overwrite any recorded data you've currently got in your sequence. If you want to add to the already recorded data, you use overdub. So whatever one you press, you're putting the transport or the sequencer into record arm mode, but this will replace record, this will overdub record, which will add additional data to your sequence. You've got a stop button here. Let's say that you've got a sound that you can't cut off. The best way to cut it off is double tap that in quick succession, and that acts as a panic button to stop all sounds. It's the same on the octave force. There's a stop button towards the top left of the octave force. You can double tap that in quick succession and that will stop all sounds. You've got your main play button. This will play from wherever you currently are in the sequence, and your play start will play from the very start of the sequence, or it will reset and go back. And of course, if you're recording, you can record from the start with play start, or you can record from the current position in the sequence. That's all the top panel controls covered. Let's now take a look at the rest of the rear panel connections and controls. So we covered the two combination inputs, which are on the furthest left. If you look just to the right of those, we've got inputs 3 and 4. So we've got the 1/4 inch line inputs. These are the vertical orientated ones, and you've got next to that the red and white RCA phono connections, and next to that you've got your ground connection there. So most turntables will have a little cable with a little fork connection on the end of it. You plug that into this little connection here, so you have to unscrew the little silver knob and put the little fork in between that and the chassis and screw that back in, and that will get rid of any ground noise or hum that you might be getting from your turntable. Like I said before, you have to switch it to phono to accept the phono signal or the turntable signal from the RCA jacks. Going to the right of that, you can see you've got your outputs. So you've got 3 sets of additional outputs aside from the main outputs. So let's go all the way to the right of that, the white ones. That is your main outputs 1 and 2. Then you've got 3 and 4, 5 and 6, 7 and 8. These can be used to split out programs or different pads to a mixing desk for more of a separated mix, which gives you more flexibility when mixing from the MPC-X. The MPC Live has 2 less outputs, so it's just got a total of 6 main outputs. Or should I say, it's got 4 auxiliary outputs and 2 main outputs. Just to the right of that, you have got the small little connections there, or the little output ports, and these are relating to modular gear. So these are your CV outputs if you've got a Eurorack modular system, and you can send different bits of information out of these. Underneath, you've got your MIDI ports. So going from the left, you've got 4 MIDI output ports. This is where you would connect things like synthesizers and drum machines that you want to control with the MPC. If you want to control the MPC with an external MIDI controller, you would use the MIDI input ports, which are the 2 furthest right MIDI ports that you can see there. So you could control the MPC with an external MIDI keyboard or something of that nature. Also, next to that, you've got 2 vertically orientated or stacked USB input ports. Now it doesn't explicitly say they're USB inputs, as it does the USB 3 port. It says USB output, you could probably see there. The reason these are inputs is because these can be used to accept a USB MIDI device to control the MPC. So you can connect a USB MIDI keyboard and control the MPC or trigger the sounds that you've got in your MPC with these USB ports. But they are also USB ports for any USB storage media that you want to connect to the MPC, whether that be a USB stick or a USB hard drive. So just think of those as inputs and not outputs. As said, the single USB 3 output port is the computer connection port. So when you get the MPCX, you'll notice that you've got a blue USB cable. You connect that out of here into your computer, and that allows you to use the MPC in controller mode, and it also will mount any removable storage media that you've got connected to your MPCX. And then last of all, on the rear panel, you've got your power connection. Just above that, you've got a little kind of latch that you can unscrew and feed your power cable through and screw that back in, and that will just hold your cable in place just in case there's a risk of it getting knocked out. With the MPC Live, this isn't much of a problem, obviously, because that runs on battery. I think if you're running it off of AC power and then pull the cable out, it will still remain on because it's got an internal battery. And then of course you've got your main power switch. Now, just like any computer, you can press and hold this for a number of seconds if you encounter a lockup or a freeze, and this will kind of reset the MPCX or restart it as you can with a computer. So last of all, to finish this tutorial on all the controls and connections for the MPCX, we've got the front panel. So going from left to right, you've got an SD card port. Now this can accept any standard SD card or micro SD adapter with a micro SD card installed. The ones that I recommend are SanDisk or Samsung or Kingston. They're the three main manufacturers. I've never had any issues with the SanDisk micro SD card that I had for the first year and a half of owning the MPCX. It never gave me any problems, other than the fact that it just ran out because it was 16 gigabytes and I maxed it out about 2 months ago. So now I've got a solid state drive that I installed in the underside of my MPCX. So that's your SD card port. Just to the right of that, you've got two foot switch controllers. Now let's just go back to the top panel view so you can see my screen. If you press menu and press preferences and go to hardware and scroll down, you can see you've got two foot switch options here. If you click on the box there, you can use you can use your data wheel to scroll through a number of parameters that you can control with an external foot switch. Just got to clear my throat again. Apologies for that, I just had to clear my throat once again. So yeah, you've got two foot switch controllers that can control a number of parameters. So you can control things like the transport controls, you can control all the pads, you can control your recording. Now I haven't got one connected, unfortunately. I might include that in a future YouTube video. I need to get a foot switch controller. You can control the function keys, you can switch pad banks, and that's where you can configure your foot switches. So let's go back to the front panel view and let's talk about the next connection. So next to the two foot switch connections, as mentioned earlier when talking about the top panel inputs and outputs and stuff like that, you've got two instrument inputs here. So these are handy for guitarists or bassists, and if you want to connect a guitar here, this is a good place to connect it. But these can also be used for any other audio source like a CD player or a synthesizer or an iPhone or anything else, providing you've got a suitable adapter and cable. So these can be used for things other than the guitar. Next to that, you've got a mix knob. Now this mix knob allows you to get a blend of the inputs 3 and 4 or your inputs 1 and 2. So when it's panned, sorry, outputs, I do apologise. This mix knob is pertaining to your outputs 1 and 2 and your outputs 3 and 4. And this relates to your headphones. So just next to that first knob that you can see going from the left, you've got your 2 headphone jacks there. You've got a mini jack or a 1/8 inch jack, and then you've got a 1/4 inch jack. So this knob next to them or to the left of them is the mix knob, which allows you to hear the outputs 1 and 2. If it's all the way anti-clockwise, you're going to hear outputs 1 and 2 in your headphones. You can hear outputs 3 and 4 if you move this knob to the right or fully clockwise. Then, just as said, you've got your 2 headphone jacks there, mini jack and 1/4 inch jack. And the last control that you've got on the MPC X is your headphone volume on the far right there. So that's it, guys. I hope you've enjoyed this video. This is mostly for complete beginners who want to know what all the cables, or rather the connections and controls, do, and a little bit of in-depth knowledge on some of the modes that these controls can access. I hope you've enjoyed this video. This was kind of an experimental live video that I've just done off the cuff because I'm trying to find different ways to present my tutorials other than YouTube at the moment, and see if it generates a little bit more traffic for me on Facebook. And as said, if I post a YouTube video on Facebook, unfortunately there's no direct way to watch it on there, and it just gives you a link to YouTube. It's not a massive problem, but there you go. It's a good way for me to teach you guys something and also experiment with how far I can reach you guys on this platform. So I hope you've enjoyed the video. I will hopefully see you on the next one, maybe on YouTube, maybe on here. Take it easy. Thanks for watching. This is Tubedigga, and I'm out.